Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Where will the jobs of tomorrow come from? I think it's a question that policymakers seem unable to answer. And not many of those in power even appear to be thinking seriously about it yet. But it is perhaps the most important single issue facing the West. What are the industries and the professions that represent our salvation in the future? And how are we going to prepare our citizens for them? I see how desolate the opportunities are for young job seekers right now. And I wonder what they will be doing to secure a livelihood 5 years hence. Now, paying jobs don't just crop up through chance or political dreaming. New jobs in the private sector that add value generally only arise when there is optimism and new capital formation in locations that are competitive in terms of costs and skills. And there are three main structural trends that are apparent to me in the world of work in the West. Firstly, jobs are moving offshore to lower-cost economies such as China and India. Secondly, technical advances mean that many sectors, such as manufacturing, mining, and agriculture, are much more efficient than they used to be, so less labor is required for a greater output. And thirdly, employing people in countries such as Britain has become much more expensive, not simply because of wage inflation, but other obligations, such as increased holiday, entitlements such as maternity and paternity leave, and higher payroll taxes. Now, unfortunately, many of the apparently boom sectors that are generating new jobs aren't generating very many. Facebook, for example, which is valued at in excess of $50 billion, actually only employs about 3,000 staff worldwide, which is perhaps a third of the number of staff that I employ in my businesses. And meanwhile, for example, unhappily, clean tech so far in this country has produced tiny numbers of new jobs. So we need to keep looking for the answers. It would help, I think, in this search if more of our best minds devoted themselves to real business rather than the appearance of business. Inventing real products, manufacturing goods, providing genuine services for profit is hard work, takes time, and is often tedious. It requires travel to savage places with industrial estates, many miles from the money centres full of skyscrapers. And my experience, having worked for a few years in the 1980s in the City of London, is actually that financial services can get quite boring. Now, I think this isn't a bad thing. Too much excitement at a big bank, and it gets very dangerous. My personal observation is I suspect that a lot of bankers are actually quite frustrated in their jobs, and they comfort themselves with big salaries and bonuses and all the rest of it. And this is compensation for working in giant, highly regulated corporations that actually have no end product except money. And secretly, I'm sure many of these highly cultivated and educated participants would rather be spending their careers on something perhaps a little more constructive, like making bridges or building cars or writing software. But sadly, real engineering doesn't necessarily pay as well as financial engineering. Now, I don't want to demonize the square mile or indeed Wall Street, but I think as a nation, we must ensure that not too many of our best talents end up there to prevent our economy continuing to develop in the lopsided fashion that I think some have argued it's currently occupying. And we need real entrepreneurs generating real jobs. And actually, that's something that Britain's immigrant population has long understood. Almost daily, I see examples of how immigrants strive, while too many members of the native population lack ambition. And I've witnessed the stunning business success and advances of our Asian communities here, thanks to diligence and resourcefulness, because most of them who came here came to Britain with nothing. And my experience suggests that ethnic entrepreneurs in Britain have been responsible for a material proportion of the private sector's economic growth and job creation in recent decades. And far from taking opportunities from locals, they've actually provided them. And I think without them, we would all be poorer. And I think, unfortunately, for quite a few fellow citizens, life has become a catalogue of excuses. And are the local individuals really so disadvantaged that they're incapable of work compared to migrants who've arrived with little more than a burning desire to achieve? Now, I accept that immigration can sometimes undercut the wages of unskilled local labour, but surely the solution is to retrain the existing workforce rather than restrict immigration. And I think if we cap immigration, that will only stem the flow of talent that I think has played a major part in Britain's economic renaissance in the last quarter century. And I think immigrants are vital to our economy, not just because of their role as entrepreneurs. They're contributors to the public purse, and I think they subsidise state services for UK-born residents. And they also comprise a high proportion of key workers. And interestingly, one of the areas I believe we're a global leader is higher education. And they've always invented faculty and students from abroad. And I think in the future they will recruit even more from places like India and China. And we should encourage them to do so. And I think new rules, if we reduce student visas, would be very destructive. Silicon Valley, for example, has benefited fantastically from the influx of bright overseas graduates who studied at places like Stanford. And they've stayed and they've invented new products and companies. We need desperately the cleverest researchers to come and work here and let them make their discoveries in Britain. Now, in the pursuit of jobs and growth, there is something that our policymakers can do even more importantly than in promoting immigration, and that is to make life easier for startups in general, promote young, fast-growing companies. I think what we need is a specific Startup Act that would act as a real catalyst to new firm creation, because much research shows that startups are the source of a disproportionate amount of innovation and job creation and overall growth. And so I think we should try to pass specific niche legislation that gives entrepreneurs further reasons to take the plunge. And for, I think, this to make a difference, it needs to be truly radical. A bit like a breakthrough business needs to be genuinely disruptive to succeed. I think modest tinkering with the system won't provide the jolt. Now, our Prime Minister has stated relatively recently that he wants Britain to be the preferred destination for new enterprises and inward investment. I think he has appeared to overlook the fact that actually currently our tax code is the longest in the world, and that the relatively recent Companies Act is the largest piece of legislation ever passed by Parliament. And we are, whether we like it or not, a high-cost, high-tax, high-regulation country by international standards. And it becomes increasingly difficult to compete with fast-growing nations like Russia and Turkey and Indonesia and Brazil and India and China, unless we want to make Britain a better place for startups. And the coalition has to be bold in this and follow all these encouraging words about entrepreneurship with action. I would suggest there are 3 areas such a Startup Act could tackle: tax, red tape, and funding. I think that in each category, Parliament could initiate special treatment for startups. I think, for example, new firms could be exempt from business rates, from national insurance on new staff, and even from corporation tax for perhaps the first 3 years. I think employees in new companies should pay no tax on any gains on share options, encourage them. I think startups should be exempt for a few years at least from a big proportion of the more onerous employment legislation, which discourages entrepreneurs from taking on staff. And I think all of these act as a series of disincentives so that people don't want to take the risk. I think on funding, the government should do more. I think 100% relief for any investment in a startup held for 5 years or more on both income and capital gains would help release more capital. I think they should also look at the idea of perhaps creating a bank specifically dedicated towards funding startups, backing early stage undertakings. And I'm afraid I don't believe that the Business Growth Fund is anything like what's needed. Now, I've spent the last 30 years starting and backing businesses and partnering with entrepreneurs, and I do have confidence that they are perhaps the biggest solution to some of the challenges that confront us, because I think human ingenuity, the profit motive, technology advances through commercial activities, and collaboration have, generally speaking, been the engine that drives human progress. And once more, that combination of factors is tending to lead this recovery. Now, by their nature, entrepreneurs don't take orders. Central planning doesn't lead to growth and innovation in a capitalist system. And I think what expansion derives from is tens of thousands of individuals working independently who start new enterprises, who invent new products and services, and that's what generates jobs and indeed wealth. And overall, in the long run, I am greatly encouraged. I see signs that we are heading in the right direction. There are now over 80 thriving entrepreneur societies in universities across the UK with over 50,000 members, including Oxford entrepreneurs who reckon they're the largest of their kind in the world. And the tragedy of high levels of youth unemployment, which we do suffer in this country, is I believe many, many thousands of these young individuals and graduates will start companies, and some of them will succeed, and perhaps a few of them will become huge. And I think many of the most exciting industries of the future are actually ones where Britain is surprisingly strong or has advantages. Things like healthcare, pharmaceuticals and bioscience, media and entertainment, tourism, hospitality, leisure, travel, specialist technology, energy services, professional services and finance, and education. And that's just a few. I have to say, I think some plans of the coalition are simply terrible. I think that the government is talking nonsense when it says it wants to promote manufacturing, and then it has the idea of cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2025. If we want manufacturing to remain in this country, we have to rethink such posturing. It will only literally force investment and jobs elsewhere. And despite their promises to cut red tape, I'm afraid to say there have already been a whole raft of new rules brought in on additional things like paternity leave, scrapping of retirement ages, and compulsory new pension laws. And these are not helpful to small businesses. Larger businesses may be able to afford them, but businesses that can't even afford, aren't big enough to have an HR department, they really struggle under that sort of administrative burden. Now, ultimately, our prospects as a nation are not in the government's hands, they're in our hands. Because I think we control our destiny, and especially entrepreneurs control their destiny. And I think, therefore, we have to apply ourselves and play to our strengths. Now, I'm not either an economist nor a historian. I'm merely a practitioner. So my perspective is not based on vast quantities of research, but rather participation and direct observation. And what my decades in business have taught me is that business is cyclical, and that actually my intelligence from the front line right now tells me that despite what one might read about the Eurozone or inflation or what have you, we are actually in the upswing, and certainly things are much better than they were in the dark days of 2008. I think big government is surely not the answer. A culture of dependency is not the answer. I think it's about the freedom and independence of entrepreneurship. I think it's about innovation and exports, and it's certainly the only cure I know for unemployment. And I think if we elect people to high office who stimulate jealousy and punish dynamism, then I think we will suffer a society rank with stagnation, underinvestment, worklessness, and despair. I don't think we want to adopt a victimhood complex. I think we need the opposite. What we need are jobs, and the best source of those are young, fast-growing companies led by fearless entrepreneurs and unencumbered investors.
Is there a route to entrepreneurship that doesn't involve bravado, that doesn't involve just completely staking everything and gambling everything? I mean, what I feel and what I hear all the time is that a lot of people are very motivated towards entrepreneurship, and you said even right, even investment banks where I used to work, that everyone wanted to seem to run their own business, but a lot of them were held back from doing so. In an environment like now, a lot of people are forced to do so because of they lose their jobs, etc. But what in an environment when they're not being forced to do so? It's still, as you say, the dynamic thing to do is to go ahead and own your business and start your own business. What can you say to someone that's on the brink?
Well, I think
wants
lots
to
of
do
things.
that?
Firstly, and I'll talk about my experience, I was a bit pragmatic in my career, so I deliberately delayed the idea of starting a family until I felt I had taken some big risks in life. I didn't want to be in a position where I could lose my home, and I had dependents. So I specifically did not start a family till later on. That's one thing. Secondly, I think actually, although entrepreneurship involves risk-taking, if you drill down, talk to entrepreneurs, and that's what I spend all my time doing, working with them, you find that they do their homework. They measure the downsides. And the fact is, you don't have to risk everything. The one single bit of advice I always give all entrepreneurs, they say, what's your, single is, don't give a personal guarantee ever. Doesn't matter whether it's the bank or it's for a lease, a property, don't give a personal guarantee. Many, many entrepreneurs appear to have come from overnight success. In fact, they've been at it for 10 years, and it's just that their progress has been invisible and incremental. Most businesses, in my experience, do take 5 to 10 years to really prove themselves. I think also it's about knowing what is safe and what isn't safe. Most people in society, in life, have a greater fear of failure than they desire gain. And actually, studies have been done to show that people will turn down, statistically, a certain gain for fear of losing something. And so I think it is about carefully analysing what's at stake if, for example, you leave a job. Now, these days, most jobs don't have a final salary pension scheme. Very few jobs are jobs for life. So in some respects, what are people losing? And, there are many benefits, I think, to being self-employed. You don't have to put up with office politics in the old way, the bureaucracy. You don't have to kowtow to a boss. You are the boss. You take credit for what you do. You have the freedom and the independence. Now, you may not earn as much money as you could. You may have responsibilities, especially if you take on staff. But, there's a lot of satisfaction. There are those who wake up at the age of whatever it is and think, I should have done that. Why didn't I do that? And I get quite frustrated with people who say, I've got an idea for a business, but I'll do it next year, or I'm waiting for the right. Do it now. The truth of the matter is that there's rarely a better time, and that a sense of urgency is the general characteristic, I would say, of most entrepreneurs, that they want to get a move on. They are impatient to push things forward and make it happen. People will forever make excuses about capital or about lack of support. If you study the careers of most successful entrepreneurs, they didn't start with a lot of capital. It was about having an idea, recruiting partners, having the persistence, and seeing it through.